The night didn't break with shouting. It cracked with the soft click of a latch and the hush that followed, the way a room holds its breath before a glass falls. Patio lights washed the dining room in a warm gold, and the guests sat too straight, smiling, too politely, like they'd been told not to move. I took 2 steps inside and smelled jasmine, a perfume I knew wasn't mine, and saw a cardigan tugged too quickly across a chest, where a sliver of pale lace peeked out lace that looked uncomfortably familiar. Mark's laugh floated from the hallway a beat off time, the laugh he used at networking events when he needed charm more than honesty. Vanessa's eyes flicked to mine, then to the floor, and the scrape of Ethan's chair sounded like a warning. No one said a word, but the story had already started telling itself. Before I go on, tell me where you're listening from tonight, and if you've ever felt a room get quiet on you for reasons you couldn't name, leave a comment and tap subscribe, so more true family stories find their way to you. My name is Claire, and I grew up in a house where the lights were paid, before the luxuries, where my mother kept envelopes labeled rent, groceries, and rain as if storms could be budgeted for. I learned numbers with the same reverence other girls learned hymns, stacking columns to make life behave. And when I met Mark at 26, he said it was my steadiness that made him feel brave. He was all sharp elbows and bright ideas, the kind of man who could turn a coffee shop conversation into a startup pitch before you finished stirring your cream, and I mistook momentum for character, because it looked so much like hope. We married in a small chapel with lemon cake and cheap champagne, promising each other a simple kind of abundance. Not yachts and penthouses, just a home that fit and a life that made sense. Paige arrived when we were still in our 30s, pink-cheeked and loud, and I tucked my career into flexible hours to keep her mornings soft and our nights predictable. When my mother passed the inheritance, she left careful money, decade by decade, became the down payment for our first house. I told myself it was an investment in our future, a vote of confidence in the man I married, a way to anchor us when his projects sailed in every direction. The papers had both our names, but in my head, it felt like I'd placed my mother's quiet years into his hands and said, "Build something that lasts." I kept the books at work and at home, made casseroles, stretched coupons into small miracles, and marveled at how easily a life can look stable when one person is measuring every line. We joined a circle of neighbors who believed in potlucks and Saturday soccer and the unspoken pact of borrowed ladders and returned Tupperware. Vanessa sparkled in that group. She could dress a table and a sentence with the same glossy finish, and I liked her at first the way women sometimes do when they recognize a well-practiced smile and decide to trust it anyway. Ethan was quieter, the kind of man who noticed if you needed a chair before you realized your knees were tired, and together they looked like the best kind of postcard marriage. On the surface, ours looked similar, the family photos, the holiday lights, the way Mark kissed my forehead when other people were watching. We had a rhythm then, sturdy and familiar. My lists and ledgers, his flights and follow-ups. Paige's school projects taped to a fridge that never quite shut right, unless you nudged it with your hip. Cracks aren't always loud. Sometimes they begin with a calendar that doesn't match a suitcase or a phone flipped face down. So often, it starts to feel like a wall. Mark's work dinners stretched later, his grin sharpened into something that looked like performance, and our conversations grew narrow, like hallways you walk through without turning on the light. I told myself every couple has seasons, that success asks for patience, that nothing is wrong when everything still looks right to the neighbors. I let the numbers soothe me, mortgage, current savings, steady tuition on schedule, and mistook the balance sheet for our vows. Paige picked up on little things I didn't want to see, asking if Dad would be home for Friday lasagna, in a voice that already knew the answer, and I laughed it off, folding napkins until the fabric left lines in my palms. The night at Vanessa and Ethan's was supposed to be easy, one of those hands-on-the-shoulders evenings where people lean on shared stories and refill each other's glasses. We split the drive because it made sense that way, me with Ethan Mark going ahead to help. and I made a joke about how my husband couldn't find the forks in our own kitchen if they cried out like a smoke alarm. The joke made Ethan smile, the polite kind that doesn't show teeth, and I took it as a sign of goodwill instead of what it was, a man bracing for impact he couldn't stop. When the door opened, the house had that staged calm of a room that's just shoveled snow behind the curtains, and somewhere in the hallway, a whisper cut off at the sound of our footsteps. You know how air thickens when people have seen something they wish they could return. That was the air I walked into, light strung across it like caution tape. There's a language to small betrayals, a grammar you only learn once you've spent enough nights counting ceiling fan blades instead of sleeping. It sounds like the wrong cologne at the right time, like a laugh you've never heard in your own kitchen, like someone's eyes sliding sideways before they meet yours. It looks like a cardigan pulled too close across a lace that belongs in a drawer you share, like a husband who steps forward and then stops, as if he's trying to remember how he usually looks when he isn't performing. In that moment, I wasn't angry yet. I was inventorying the way accountants do in rooms full of boxes. What is here? What is missing? What was never labeled the way you thought? And still, I smiled, because sometimes dignity is the only coat you can reach for when the temperature drops without warning. When I left Vanessa's house that night, the air clung heavy on my skin, carrying the echo of voices that had fallen silent the moment the door opened. I walked to my car with Ethan a few steps behind me, his face pale, his lips pressed into a hard line that said more than words ever could. My heels clicked against the pavement like a metronome, the sound too sharp in the quiet neighborhood. I gripped the steering wheel once I slid into the driver's seat, my fingers stiff and cold despite the warm Texas night. It wasn't just what I had seen, it was what I could no longer pretend not to see. At home, the house felt hollow. The kitchen clock ticked louder than usual, and every photo on the walls seemed to hold its breath. I sat at the dining table where only hours earlier I had thought we would end our weekend with laughter and simple conversation. Instead, I sat staring at the wood grain, trying to gather the strength to stand. When the front door opened later and Mark stepped inside, his tie loose, his expression caught between irritation and practiced calm. I felt my chest tighten. He didn't ask where I'd been. He didn't ask how my night was. He simply poured himself a glass of water and moved through the house like nothing had cracked open between us. The signs had been there, hadn't they? The late dinners that stretched past midnight. The sudden trips to Dallas that never seemed to match his calendar. The phone that stayed face down, even at breakfast. Each time I had asked, he laughed, kissed my forehead, and told me I was worrying too much. I wanted so badly to believe him, to believe that my careful planning and my sacrifices weren't holding up a life that was slowly leaving me behind. I told myself love meant trust, even when trust felt like swallowing glass. Paige noticed long before I admitted it. A few weeks earlier, she had walked into the kitchen while I was folding laundry and said in a voice so soft, "I nearly missed it, Mom. I think Dad's seeing someone." The clothes slipped from my hands, tumbling into a heap on the counter. My first instinct was to shield her, to keep her from knowing a truth I wasn't strong enough to face. I asked why she thought that hoping for a misunderstanding I could cling to. She told me she had seen him downtown holding hands with a woman who wasn't me, and she hadn't said anything because she thought she might be wrong. The look in her eyes told me she knew she wasn't. I had lied to her then. I told her it was probably a coworker, that her dad was just being friendly, that she must have misread it. But the lie didn't comfort her. Her silence afterward was sharper than any words she could have spoken. She knew I was protecting her, and she also knew I was protecting myself. In the days that followed, she grew quieter, spending more time in her room. the music from her headphones filling the spaces where conversation used to be. Looking back, I can see how long I had been pretending. When my mother passed the inheritance she left me was meant to secure my future, but I had handed it over to Mark as if it were a gift for him alone. That money became the down payment on our first house. The walls we painted together, the backyard we promised Paige would grow up in. I told myself it was an investment in us, a way to build something lasting. But the truth is, it was the first stone in a castle he thought he owned. I scaled back my own ambitions so he could chase his. I cut my hours, managed the budget, and made sure the bills were paid on time. Every promotion he earned, every new client he boasted about, every sleek car he parked in the driveway, those were framed as his victories. My role was to smile, to host, to make sure dinner was on the table, and to listen when he needed to rehearse his speeches. I became the steady backdrop against which his story unfolded, and I told myself it was enough. But that night at Vanessa's house made the truth undeniable. The lace I had bought for myself, delicate, pale, worn once for him, and tucked away since, was stretched across another woman's skin. The intimacy wasn't just about the kiss or the hands clawing at fabric. It was about possession. It was about taking something that was mine and using it to humiliate me in front of people who would never forget. The days after were filled with a silence that cut deeper than shouting. Mark acted as though nothing had changed, moving through his routines with forced cheer, asking Paige about school as if her eyes weren't dark with knowledge. I wanted to scream, to demand answers, but the words stuck in my throat. Each time he brushed past me in the kitchen, each time his phone buzzed in his pocket and he stepped outside. My chest burned with the weight of what I couldn't say. Nights became the hardest. I would lie awake listening to the faint hum of his computer from the study, wondering if the screen showed spreadsheets or messages to her. I thought about the years I had given him, the dinners I had planned, the nights I had spent waiting for him to come home. I thought about the promises we had made in that small chapel with lemon cake and cheap champagne, promises that now felt like ash in my mouth. And yet beneath the grief, something else began to take root. I realized I wasn't simply mourning a marriage. I was mourning the years I had handed over without question, the parts of myself I had set aside in the name of love. I had been steady, loyal, dependable, but none of it had kept him from seeking something else. That knowledge didn't crush me the way I feared it would. It hardened me. I started noticing the little things I had ignored before. How he bristled if Paige asked too many questions. How he avoided my eyes when I set his plate down at dinner. How his phone never left his pocket even when he stepped into the shower. Each detail was a piece of a puzzle I had tried not to assemble, but once the picture began to form, I couldn't unsee it. One evening, while Mark was upstairs, Paige lingered at the kitchen table with her homework. She tapped her pencil against the page, then looked at me with the same quiet bravery she'd shown before. "Mom," she said, "you don't have to pretend." The words landed like a stone dropped in water, rippling outward until I felt them in every part of me. She wasn't asking me to explain. She was telling me she saw the truth, and she was waiting for me to admit it too. I didn't answer her that night. I wasn't ready. But as I loaded the dishwasher and listened to her footsteps fade down the hall, I knew the silence between us couldn't last much longer. Something had to break, and it couldn't just be my heart again. The cursor blinked on the screen, steady and insistent, as if daring me to act. Our joint account had always been my responsibility, the bills and budgets carefully balanced in neat columns. I had stretched every dollar to make a life that looked seamless from the outside. Now, for the first time, I wasn't moving money to keep us afloat. I was moving it to protect myself and Paige. My hands trembled, but I clicked through the transfers, placing every cent I could legally shield into an account Mark couldn't reach. The numbers shifted across the screen, and I felt a strange rush like air rushing into lungs starved too long. I shut the laptop and sat still at the table listening to the quiet hum of the refrigerator. For years, I had thought of our home as secure because I managed it that way, not because Mark valued what I did. That night, I realized security could also mean closing doors, even against the man whose key still fit the lock. My chest hurt with the weight of it, but underneath the ache was a small thread of resolve. I wasn't going to let him drag me further down. The next morning, I called a law office I'd found after hours of searching the night before. My voice cracked as I gave the receptionist my name, but she was calm and efficient. By noon, I was sitting in a quiet office with Jillian Hayes, a woman with silver threaded through her dark hair and eyes that didn't flinch. She listened without interruption as I told her about the dinner party, the inheritance, the phone calls Paige had overheard. She didn't gasp, didn't pity. She only took notes with a steady hand and told me that moving the money had been the right first step. Jillian outlined what came next. She spoke of custody temporary orders and asset freezes in a way that was sharp but not frightening. Each word she spoke felt like a light being turned on in a dark hallway. For the first time in months, I wasn't alone with the knowledge of his betrayal. I left her office with a folder of documents and the certainty that a path forward existed even if it was steep. That afternoon, I began packing a suitcase. I didn't take everything, just clothes for Paige and me, our passports, and the box of photographs my mother had left me. Folding shirts into neat lines felt surreal, like preparing for a trip that had no return ticket. My hands shook not from fear, but from the adrenaline that surged each time I remembered his face at Vanessa's doorway. He hadn't looked ashamed. He had looked furious at being caught. That fury told me more than any confession ever could. The first ripple hit within hours. My phone buzzed with his name on the screen, but I let it ring. A message came minutes later. "Claire, we need to talk. Don't overreact." I stared at those words until my vision blurred. Overreact. As if watching him touch another woman while she wore my lingerie was a misunderstanding. I deleted the text without replying. An hour later, the front door opened. His key still worked, and he stepped inside like he owned the air I breathed. His voice carried before I even saw him. "What the hell did you do with the accounts?" He was red-faced, his tie pulled loose, anger rolling off him like heat. I stood in the doorway to the kitchen, arms crossed, trying to keep my voice steady. "I did what I had to do. You don't get to betray me and still expect me to bankroll your life." He slammed a fist against the counter, his jaw tight. "You're destroying everything we built." I laughed, though it sounded brittle in my ears. "No, Mark. You destroyed it. I'm just cleaning up the wreckage." He shifted tactics in an instant, his anger melting into false softness. "Claire, come on. It was a mistake. A stupid mistake. Don't do this to us. Don't do this to Paige." Her name on his lips felt like poison. I stepped closer, my voice sharp. "Don't you dare use her to shield yourself. She saw you, Mark. She knows, and she deserves better than what you've given her." For the first time, panic flickered across his face. He hadn't known Paige was aware. That knowledge gave me more strength than anything else. I didn't give him a chance to recover. "I've already spoken to a lawyer. This is happening. You can fight, but you won't win. Not this time." He clenched his jaw, muttered something I couldn't catch, then grabbed his keys and stormed out. The door slammed so hard the picture frames rattled on the wall. I stood in the silence that followed, my heart pounding, my breath shaky. But it wasn't fear anymore. It was resolve. The following days passed in a blur. News of the dinner party spread faster than I imagined. Austin wasn't small, but in our circle, gossip traveled like fire on dry grass. Friends texted condolences, some offered help, others simply expressed shock. One message from an old friend read, "About time you saw him for who he is." Each note stung, but they also shifted the shame away from me. His choices were out in the open now, and I no longer carried the humiliation alone. Vanessa wasn't spared either. Ethan's silence lasted barely a day before he posted a thinly veiled message online. The words didn't name her, but everyone knew. Comments flooded in sympathy wrapped in sharp undertones, and her carefully polished image began to unravel. I didn't add my voice. I didn't need to. Silence worked better than any statement I could make. Meanwhile, the financial chokehold began to bite. Mark had grown accustomed to spending freely the dinners, the hotel rooms, the gifts he thought I didn't know about. Now his cards declined. He sent another message, this one more clipped, "You've made your point. Turn the accounts back on. We'll talk." I didn't respond. It wasn't a point. It was a line he couldn't cross again. Paige watched all of this unfold with quiet eyes. One night, she asked, "Mom, is Dad coming back?" I paused, folding laundry slowly to buy time. "Not like before," I told her. "Things are changing." Her eyes filled, but she didn't cry. She just nodded, and in that moment, I saw her strength, the same strength I was only beginning to claim for myself. By the weekend, Mark showed up again, pounding on the door with a desperation I hadn't seen before. I opened it just enough to look him in the eye. His face was drawn unshaven, his voice low. "Claire, please. We can fix this. Just the two of us. No lawyers, no drama." I shook my head. "You threw it away. I'm just making sure everyone sees it for what it is." His expression hardened, the pleading gone. "You're destroying me." "No," I said, my voice steady. "You're destroying yourself. I'm just stepping aside so the world can see." I shut the door before he could say another word. Afterward, my hands shook, but not from fear. For the first time in years, I felt power in my silence. Paige and I sat on the couch, turned on a movie, and let the noise of the outside world fade away. She leaned her head against my shoulder, and I felt lighter, as if the weight I'd carried for so long was finally shifting. The restaurant wasn't my battlefield, but when I walked through its glass doors one Saturday afternoon, fate laid the ground for me. Paige and I had joined my sister Lauren for lunch, something simple to get us out of the house. The room buzzed with silverware and low chatter, a place where families gathered after errands or couples lingered over wine. Then across the room, I saw Mark. He was seated in the corner with two colleagues, men I knew by name, but not by warmth. Men he relied on to keep his business afloat. His hair was trimmed, his shirt crisp, his smile rehearsed. For a moment, I thought about walking past him, pretending not to notice. Then his phone lit up on the table, the screen glowing with Vanessa's name. I stopped mid-step, my hand tightening on Paige's shoulder. Lauren followed my gaze, her jaw tightening as she took in the scene. Mark's colleagues exchanged glances, clearly aware of the name that flashed across his screen. My decision came quickly, without rehearsal. I turned toward his table, my heels striking against the tile, each step pulling the air tighter in the room. He looked up, startled, his confident smile faltering as I approached. "Mark," I said, my voice carrying just enough for his companions to hear. His eyes widened, then narrowed as he attempted to recover. "Claire," he said lightly, "this isn't the time." I leaned forward, close enough for his mask to crack. Then tell them I said. Tell your colleagues who Vanessa is. Or should I? The men at his table looked uneasy, shifting in their seats. One asked quietly, "What's this about?" I kept my eyes on Mark, watching his face drain of color. This is about the husband who pretends to be faithful while humiliating his wife with her own friend. It's about the father who thinks deception is the same as love. Gasps rippled through nearby tables. Mark reached for my arm, his voice low. "Claire, stop." I pulled back before he touched me. "Don't," I said clearly. "You've already touched enough that doesn't belong to you." His colleagues looked at him, waiting for a denial he couldn't give. One of them cleared his throat, his voice heavy with doubt. "Is this true?" I gave the final blow without hesitation. "Ask him why his mistress was wearing my lingerie the night I walked in on them." The words settled like a stone in the center of the room. Silverware clattered onto plates. Conversations died mid-sentence. Phones came out, screens raised to capture the scene. Mark's face turned crimson, his mouth opening and closing without sound. His colleagues pushed back their chairs and stood abruptly, muttering excuses as they walked away, leaving him alone at the table. I straightened, adjusted my bag, and looked him in the eye. "You thought you could bury me?" I said softly. "But I'm not the one suffocating." Then I turned, walked back to where Paige and Lauren waited, and left the restaurant without looking back. Outside, the air was bright and sharp. Paige's eyes were wide, but instead of embarrassment, there was pride shining through her expression. Lauren placed a steadying hand on my arm, whispering, "You did what needed to be done." My phone began buzzing, almost immediately, messages already spreading about what had happened. By the time we drove home, the story was out in the city's bloodstream. Mark had tried to control the narrative, but I had cut the strings. 2 days later, his face appeared on a local news site. A friend texted me the link with a note that said simply, "You'll want to see this." Mark sat in a studio chair, polished and polite, speaking in measured tones. Rumors and exaggerations, he said with practiced calm. "Claire has always been dramatic. I've made mistakes, but nothing close to what's being said. I just want privacy for my daughter and me." My jaw tightened as I watched. He hadn't just denied the affair. He had painted me as unstable, the angry wife, too emotional to be trusted. Worst of all, he used Paige's name as a shield, trying to twist the narrative until I became the villain. That evening, Jillian called. Her voice carried urgency. "Claire, you need to see what's just come through." She forwarded me a file, pages of screenshots, text messages, and receipts. Ethan had combed through Vanessa's phone records, her emails, even her cloud storage, and he had found everything. Hotel confirmations, love notes, photographs that left nothing to the imagination. At first, I didn't want to look. The thought of seeing the words Mark had written to her made me nauseous. But I forced myself because this wasn't about pain anymore. It was about proof. One message stood out above all others. Sent a week before the dinner party, it read, "I can't wait until she's out of the picture. You'll look so much better in her place." The words were cold, stripped of any pretense of love for me or even for Paige. They reduced our marriage to a placeholder he was eager to discard. Ethan leaked the message quietly at first, but within hours it spread across social media. Strangers mocked him, memes appeared, hashtags formed. His image as a successful consultant crumbled into a caricature of arrogance and betrayal. Paige showed me one of the memes one evening, her face torn between disgust and grim satisfaction. It was a photo of a man in a suit holding lingerie on a hanger, captioned, "Does it come in my wife's size?" She asked quietly, "Mom, is it okay if I laugh?" I pulled her close. "Yes," I told her, "it's more than okay." Mark tried to fight back online. He posted on LinkedIn writing about forgiveness cancel culture and the dangers of false narratives. He called himself a man trying to do right by his family while lies swirled around him. But the comments flooded with screenshots with blunt questions he couldn't answer. His polished statements collapsed under the weight of undeniable evidence. Meanwhile, Ethan released more proof. Bank statements showed questionable charges. Emails revealed business trips timed perfectly with Vanessa's vacations. Ride receipts confirmed nights when Mark claimed to be working late but had been dropped off at her condo. Each piece of evidence nailed his story shut. The backlash grew relentless. Local blogs picked it up, then gossip pages. And finally, a podcast dedicated to Austin's scandals devoted an episode to his downfall. His name was everywhere, not tied to his work or accomplishments, but to betrayal and humiliation. Videos surfaced of him entering bars or restaurants only to be mocked openly by strangers. Someone shouted "lingerie liar" in one clip, and the crowd laughed while cameras recorded his fury. I stayed silent. I didn't post or respond. I didn't need to. The truth spoke louder than anything I could add. At home, Paige asked if it felt good seeing people turn on him. I thought for a moment before answering. "It doesn't feel good," I said. "It feels fair." By the end of the week, Mark stopped posting entirely. His accounts went quiet, his face disappeared from interviews, and his presence shrank until only whispers remained. But the damage was done. His reputation, the thing he valued most, had shattered in public view. Jillian's words stayed with me after our last meeting. Humiliation wasn't enough. Gossip faded, and online fury shifted with the next scandal. If I wanted lasting change, it had to come from the courts. That thought steadied me even as I walked into the courthouse for the first hearing with my chest tight and my palms damp. The building smelled faintly of polished wood and old paper, the kind of place where truth is meant to outlast theatrics. I took a seat beside Jillian, her calm presence a lifeline, as Mark entered with his attorney, a man in an expensive suit who looked like he'd been rehearsing smug expressions in the mirror. The judge was deliberate, her tone clipped, but not unkind. Jillian laid out the evidence with precision: receipts, texts, photographs, while Mark's attorney objected in bursts that sounded more like performance than substance. I watched Mark shift in his chair, his jaw tight, his eyes avoiding mine. For years, I had been the one shrinking while he held the spotlight. Now, under the weight of proof, he looked smaller than I had ever seen him. When Jillian slid the folder across the table, the silence in the courtroom deepened. The judge skimmed the pages, then set them down with a firmness that seemed to close a door. "This is compelling," she said simply. The ruling came swiftly. Mark was ordered to provide temporary spousal support, full child support, and to leave our joint assets frozen until further review. I was granted continued possession of the house and control over Paige's school expenses. Relief rushed through me like a tide, not because of the money, but because a system had finally named what he had tried to deny. When we stepped into the hallway afterward, Mark glared at me with eyes that still smoldered with anger, but the fight in his voice had dimmed. The financial strain hit him faster than I imagined. His cards declined. His accounts restricted the lifestyle he had grown so accustomed to, suddenly out of reach. Word traveled that his brother, who had always been quick to defend him, had stopped returning calls. They worked in the same company, and I knew his brother's silence meant more than family distance. It meant Mark was becoming a liability in the business world, too. Investors didn't like scandal, and loyalty rarely stretched beyond profit. At home, Paige and I found a rhythm we hadn't known in years. Dinner at the table became normal again, her laughter no longer weighed down by waiting for her father's late arrival. One evening, as she helped me clear plates, she asked quietly, "Does this mean it's almost over?" I paused, meeting her eyes. "Not yet," I said softly. But we're getting closer. She nodded as if she understood that battles sometimes stretch longer than we wish, but also as if she trusted that I wouldn't stop until it was finished. Meanwhile, Mark tried to reclaim control in smaller ways. He showed up to hearings looking more worn, each time his hair less groomed, his shirts wrinkled. Sometimes he tried to bargain in the hallways, his voice dropping low as he leaned close. "Claire, we don't have to drag this out. Let's settle quietly. You'll ruin me if this goes further." Each time I turned away. His desperation wasn't my burden. His ruin was his own making. The next blow came at a family meeting I didn't attend, but heard about through whispers. His father, a man who valued reputation more than affection, told him flatly that he was cut off. No more loans, no inheritance, promises no protection. "You've embarrassed this family," he reportedly said, "and I won't be dragged down with you." For years, Mark had strutted with the assurance that family money and influence would always cushion his fall. Now, even that safety net had been yanked away. Vanessa's world collapsed in tandem. Ethan filed for divorce, swiftly armed with the same proof Jillian and I carried. He moved out, took their children, and left her standing in the ruins of her perfect image. Friends who had once circled her disappeared, leaving her to face whispers and silence. From a distance, I watched it unravel, but I didn't gloat. Their choices had written their endings. I was simply no longer a character in their script. Still, Mark wasn't finished trying to twist the knife. At one hearing, he muttered threats about taking Paige from me, his voice sharp enough to cut. My stomach dropped at the sound, but Jillian leaned close and whispered, "Empty words. He has no case." She was right. With his affair public and his judgment shredded, no judge would hand him custody. Still, hearing him say it reminded me why I had to stand firm. It wasn't just about me anymore. It was about protecting the girl who had already seen too much. Weeks stretched into months, each hearing stripping away another piece of his pride. The house he tried to cling to was forced onto the market. Creditors' circled cards declined, and his polished image crumbled into a man barely holding on. He moved into a cramped apartment downtown, and whispers reached me of empty pizza boxes stacked by the door. Each outburst in court only dug him deeper, his temper betraying him in front of the judge. The day of the custody ruling arrived heavy with expectation. I sat at the table, hands clasped, while Jillian's voice filled the room with calm authority. The judge listened, reviewed the evidence, and then spoke words that landed like a gavel against stone. Sole custody was granted to me. Mark's visitation would be strictly supervised until he could demonstrate stability. This court finds Mr. Whitman's behavior reckless, his judgment impaired, and his home environment unsuitable for a minor. Mark slumped in his chair, the fight draining from his posture. He looked at me across the table, his eyes hollow as if he couldn't believe the ground had shifted so completely beneath him. But it had, and there was no going back. When I walked out of that courtroom, Paige met me in the hallway with a hug so tight I could hardly breathe. "We're really free now, aren't we?" she whispered. I kissed the top of her head. "Yes, baby, we are." The paperwork dragged on, splitting assets, signing documents, endless lines that seemed to stretch forever. But the outcome was sealed. Piece by piece, dollar by dollar, ally by ally. Mark's empire crumbled. By the time the dust settled, he was a man stripped of the image he had built, while Paige and I stood steadier than ever. I thought the custody ruling would be the final chapter, the moment when Mark slipped into the shadows for good. But men like him rarely vanish without one last attempt to reclaim what they've lost. It happened on a Sunday afternoon, gray skies pressing low over downtown. Paige was at a friend's house, and I had taken myself to a cafe with the notebook catching up on work while the smell of coffee and rain filled the air. When I stepped outside with my cup in hand, I saw him. Mark leaned against the brick wall near the corner, thinner than I remembered, his eyes bloodshot, his clothes rumpled. For a moment, I almost didn't recognize him. He looked less like the man I had married, and more like someone frayed at the edges, worn down to something brittle. "Claire," he said as he stepped forward. His voice cracked softer than I'd ever heard it. "Please, just hear me out." I froze in place, instinct telling me to walk away. But something heavier kept me still. Maybe I wanted to hear what was left of him. Maybe I wanted to know if there was anything behind the anger and arrogance he'd carried for years. I found a bench nearby and sat, keeping a distance between us. He followed, shoulders slumped, his hands shoved into his pockets. "I've lost everything," he admitted, his voice low, almost swallowed by the hum of traffic. "The house, the money, the job. My own family won't return my calls. Vanessa's gone. Everyone's gone." His words fell into the damp air, desperate and raw. I sipped my coffee, the heat grounding me, and looked at him without flinching. "That's what happens when you build on lies, Mark. It all comes down eventually." He winced as if the words struck him, then shifted quickly to another plea. "But we had good years, didn't we? Don't you remember? We built something together." "I made mistakes. Yes, but you can't erase everything we had." For a long moment I studied him. His eyes searched mine, but I didn't feel the ache I once expected. "You're right," I said evenly. "I can't erase it, but I can end it, and I already have." His jaw tightened. "I'm begging you, Claire. Give me one more chance. Let me fix this." His voice cracked again, the man who once held entire rooms with his confidence now reduced to trembling words. The irony wasn't lost on me. For years, I had begged him to come home on time, to tell me the truth, to love me the way he pretended to love everyone else. Now here he was, begging me, stripped of everything that once made him untouchable. "You don't get another chance," I told him, my voice steady, calm. "You had years of them, and you threw each one away." His shoulders shook, his hands covering his face as he muttered, "I don't know how to live like this. I don't know what to do." I leaned forward, my tone sharp but measured. "Then figure it out, because I won't save you. Not now. Not ever." He lifted his head, his eyes red, his expression hollow. "Claire, just tell me what I can do." I stood, tossing the empty cup into the trash. My heart didn't race, my hands didn't tremble. I wasn't the woman who had once walked into Vanessa's hallway and felt her world collapse. I was the woman who had rebuilt it piece by piece. "You're the architect of your own destruction," I said. The words hung in the air between us, final and immovable. He crumpled at the sound, his face breaking in a way I had never seen before. I turned and walked away, my heels clicking against the wet pavement, never once looking back. There was nothing left to see. 6 months passed quietly after that day. My life no longer resembled the ruins he left behind. It wasn't perfect healing, never is, but it was mine. The house felt lighter, as if the walls themselves had exhaled. I repainted Paige's room, brightening it with colors she chose herself. The kitchen got new cabinets, and I turned the office into a small studio where I picked up freelance work. Money wasn't tight. My mother's inheritance, once tangled in Mark's ambitions, was firmly back in my hands. Between the court rulings and the support payments, Paige and I had stability. Not extravagance, not wealth, but a calm steadiness I had longed for. Paige thrived in the quiet. She laughed louder, studied harder, spoke more freely. Sometimes I caught her looking at me with a quiet pride that brought tears to my eyes. One evening, as we cleaned up after dinner, she said softly, "You're stronger now, Mom. I can see it." I hugged her tightly, knowing she was stronger too, forged by truth instead of illusion. I rediscovered myself in pieces. I started running again, something I had abandoned years earlier when evenings became consumed with waiting. I joined a writing workshop on Tuesday nights, letting words pour out in ways I hadn't imagined. One weekend, Paige and I drove to New Mexico just to see the desert because we could. Each step away from him was a step toward the woman I had buried under compromise. As for Mark, I only heard of him in whispers. His brother eventually pushed him out of the company after investors withdrew, unwilling to gamble on scandal. He moved from one small consulting job to another, barely scraping by. Vanessa had long since disappeared from his orbit, divorced and forgotten. The man, who once walked into rooms with polished confidence, now couldn't enter a bar without someone muttering the words that had become his label. Lingerie liar. One afternoon, Paige and I passed him downtown. He was thinner, carrying a plastic grocery bag filled with wrinkled shirts. Our eyes met briefly, but I felt nothing. He looked away, first, and that was the moment I knew I was free. Not because he was ruined, but because he no longer had any power over me. 6 months after the final court ruling, my life had settled into something I hadn't felt in years: peace. The house that once echoed with tension felt lighter, almost as if the walls had finally exhaled. I repainted the rooms that had carried too many memories, choosing colors Paige and I picked together. The soft blue in her bedroom, the warm yellow in the kitchen, each shade felt like a fresh promise. I threw myself into small rituals that had nothing to do with Mark and everything to do with reclaiming my space. Morning runs before work, Tuesday night, writing workshops, and Saturday afternoons spent with Lauren, who reminded me that laughter could return even after years of silence. Paige blossomed her grades, climbing her confidence, returning her smile unguarded in ways I hadn't seen since she was little. It was as if in the quiet absence of his chaos, she could finally hear her own voice. Money was steady. The inheritance from my mother was secure again, and with the support orders firmly in place, I no longer had to watch every receipt with clenched teeth. I wasn't living extravagantly, but I was living freely. There's a difference, and I could feel it in the way I breathed when I woke up in the morning. Still, Mark's shadow lingered in whispers. I heard from mutual acquaintances that his brother had pushed him out of the company, tired of trying to patch holes in a sinking ship. Without investors, his projects dried up. He moved from one consulting job to another, each one shorter and less promising than the last. The man who once strutted into rooms now slipped into them, hoping no one would notice. Vanessa's collapse was quieter, but just as sharp. Ethan finalized their divorce, swiftly taking the children and the house. Her polished circle of friends dwindled, unwilling to risk their own reputations by standing too close. Every so often, I caught a glimpse of her on social media, her posts stripped of sparkle, her words edged with a kind of bitterness that only comes when the mirror finally cracks. For me, justice wasn't loud. It wasn't in headlines or whispers, though those had their place. It was in the steady, unshakable rhythm of ordinary life. Eating dinner at the table without waiting for excuses. Driving Paige to school and knowing she wouldn't see her father's car parked at another woman's house. Falling asleep without wondering whose perfume would cling to his shirt. Justice was in the quiet, and it was enough. But the world had its own way of reminding Mark who he had become. A friend of Lauren's showed me a video one evening. It was taken outside a bar downtown. Mark tried to walk through the crowd, but someone shouted "Lingerie liar," and laughter erupted. His face twisted with anger, but the cameras caught it all, uploaded and shared within minutes. Strangers mocked him while he tried to disappear. I didn't laugh when I saw it, but I also didn't flinch. His reputation had written its own ending. Paige asked me once, "Does it feel good seeing everyone turn on him?" I thought carefully before answering. "It doesn't feel good," I said. "It feels fair." She nodded, her eyes older than her years, understanding more than a teenager should. One afternoon, months after I had last spoken to him, Paige and I passed him downtown. He carried a plastic grocery bag with wrinkled shirts inside. His shoulders slumped, his face pale and unshaven. Our eyes met briefly, and in that moment I felt no anger, no grief, just nothing. He looked away first, and that was when I knew I was free. Justice hadn't come from revenge in the way people imagine it. It hadn't come from shouting or dramatic scenes. It came from patience, from truth, from refusing to carry his shame as my own. His world collapsed because he built it on lies. Mine stood because I rebuilt it with honesty. That night, as Paige and I sat on the couch watching a movie, she leaned her head on my shoulder and whispered, "We're okay now, aren't we?" I kissed the top of her hair and answered, "Yes, baby. We are." When the storm of courtrooms gossip and whispered judgment finally passed, what remained was quiet. Not empty, not bitter quiet, in the best sense of the word. My days began without dread. My nights ended in peace. The house felt like home again, a place of warmth rather than a stage for someone else's performance. Paige flourished in that stillness. She studied with focus, laughed with her friends, and leaned into the steadiness I had fought so hard to protect for her. Sometimes I'd catch her watching me across the dinner table, a smile tugging at the corner of her mouth, as if she wanted to tell me she saw the change too. And I think she did. She saw her mother rise from the ashes of betrayal, not with fire, but with quiet resolve. Lauren remained my anchor, dropping by on weekends, filling the kitchen with stories from her long shifts at the hospital. We no longer spoke often of Mark or Vanessa because there was nothing left to say. Their choices had carved their endings. Ours was to keep living lighter and freer each day, a step farther from the shadows they left behind. As for Mark, the last time I glimpsed him was on a downtown sidewalk carrying a plastic grocery bag, shoulders bent, face hollowed. He looked at me for a second, then turned away as though he couldn't bear the weight of meeting my eyes. In that moment, I felt no anger, no victory, just release. He had built his world on lies, and when it collapsed, it was his, alone, to carry. Justice came, but not in the way I once imagined. It wasn't in his humiliation at the restaurant, or in the headlines that mocked him, though those moments mattered. Justice was steadier, quieter. It was in the freedom to live without fear, in the dignity of knowing I never needed to sink to his level to rise above him. The truth did the work I couldn't, and it left me whole. If there is a lesson in what I lived, it is this: betrayal will shake the ground beneath you, but it does not have to break you. You can choose not to carry another person's shame. You can gather what is yours, your worth, your dignity, your love for your children, and build something stronger than what was taken from you. Today, I look in the mirror and see more than a betrayed wife. I see a woman who survived, who rebuilt, who gave her daughter the gift of truth instead of illusion. I see someone who knows that silence can be power, that justice doesn't always roar, it often whispers. And in those whispers, I found myself again. Before we close, I'd love to know, have you ever faced a moment where choosing dignity over anger made all the difference? Share your thoughts in the comments. And if you'd like to hear more true family stories, stay connected here.